of that, our colleague Carla, who will speak also later, she also provided a very nice summary of the state of play for the Regional Studies Association blog, which we'll put here in the comment notes because I think complements what we're going to say. Anyway, that is where we are. So say mute your microphone, and I think we're gonna kickstart. So maybe I'm gonna give the floor precisely to Carla.
Thanks, Serafin, for the introduction, and thanks to all for joining this webinar today. We are very happy to bring up some of the results from the granular project, the Rustic project, but also really speaking about the state of art on rural diversity and rural multifunctionalities. I would ask my colleague to turn on the recording so that we can record this session. And while doing so maybe Maite or Merveille, the first speaker today is going to be Mats Gebern, so Senior Research Fellow at North Region with a background on urban geography and regional studies. And he's also the main author of the scoping report on rural typologies, which have been produced by Granular and published last year. So Mats is going to present us the key findings of this report and how different territorial typologies are defined and designed in different countries, as well as key strengths and pitfalls. So Mats, I leave you the floor.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Carla and Serafin. So welcome also on my behalf. My name is Mats Schamberi. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at Nordregio. And as Carla just mentioned, the focus of my presentation will be on the work that we are doing in Granular Task 4.6, essentially working with rural typologies. So essentially, this part of the Granular project, this task 4.6 is called Characterizing Rural Diversity. And you could say that this is based on the notion that there is a need for a more granular or nuanced understanding of really how diverse rural areas across Europe are. And really that we are talking about a rather heterogeneous type of area, or types of areas rather. So my presentation will now mainly focus on this typology scoping report that we published last year. This is basically a inventory of existing rural typologies. We looked at what kind of different typologies exist across Europe, and then conducted a assessment of how these typologies are used, and looked at these typologies from different perspectives that I will go into in just a minute. And just to start off, I also wanted to mention that now my presentation will primarily focus here on the typology scoping report, but the final end output of this work will be developing a multi-criteria rural typology for the whole of Europe. So that's then the work that this typology scoping report feeds into. And you could say that this is the first operational step in carrying out this work and really examining what kind of typologies there are right now and what kind of inspiration and learnings we can draw from the existing examples. So the typology scoping report you can see here, and you can access it from the link that you see there on the slide. Basically, this was a report where the main purpose was really to carry out an inventory of what kind of typologies, territorial typologies and rural typologies there are across Europe. We looked at these typologies, why they have been developed, sort of what the rationale was, and how they are used. We also looked at how they are constructed, looking a bit more at different technical aspects, and also then assessed what kind of strengths and weaknesses there are when we're looking at these different typologies, and again, using this as inspiration for the typology development work being carried out in Granular. We looked at two main types of typologies. We looked at European-wide typologies, but also at national or regional typologies. So we really want to get typologies from different territorial scales and then see how they are used in different types of policy contexts. And then we could also divide or sort of categorize these typologies that we examined in the reports into two main categories. So first of all, we have typologies where the focus is on delimiting rural areas. So sort of the focus there in these typologies is on identifying rural areas then according to certain specific criteria. And then the second category are typologies that where the main intention is more to characterize or classify different types of rural areas. So then to identify maybe something based on multifunctionality, but what types of different typologies there are essentially. And of course, even though these are two distinct categories that we sort of looked at, it's also important to highlight that these are not mutually exclusive, and in many cases, the step is first to use a typology to delimit, and then further then in the next step to classify these areas that are then identified as rural areas into different types of categories. So we looked at different types of European-wide typologies from Eurostat, from the OECD, different examples from SFON, and so forth. Perhaps the degree of urbanization is the one that most of us are familiar with, a highly established one. And then in addition to these EU-wide macro-regional typologies, we also examined typologies from different European countries. The ambition was to get a broad coverage. We were not able to get entire coverage of the EU, but nonetheless, we identified 51 typologies from 27 European countries, also including Albania, Norway, Serbia, and the UK as non-EU countries. So now on the coming slides, I will sort of now present some of the key takeaways from these examples that we examined. Here again, we see some of the selected typologies that we discuss a bit more in depth in the report. I will not now have an in-depth examination of these specific typologies, but rather look at the broader picture, but highlight some of these examples here on the coming slides. So one of the key questions of interest in our study was to look at what the purpose was, why these typologies have been created, and also then how they are used. Well, obviously why we're meeting today is really to talk about how we can grasp rural diversity. And this is also something that is common to, you could say, all the typologies that we looked at in the report. So the typologies have somehow been developed to provide a richer or more nuanced understanding of rural diversity and territorial differences. In many cases, we see that the typologies have been developed based on previously existing typologies. For example, the Finnish urban-rural typology was developed initially in Finland. They used a municipality-based typology, but then around 15 years ago, it became quite widely acknowledged that having such large municipalities really conceals territorial differences, and there is a need for something more fine-grained. So then the step was to develop this grid-based typology. So this is something that we see common, that these typologies have been developed from more general typologies to then creating something a bit more fine-grained and detailed. Another common aspect that we see is many of the typologies have been developed so that new dimensions have been added to previously existing typologies to then further capture, rural diversity, you could say. Then of course, when we talk about why these typologies have been developed, it's also important to sort of acknowledge and think about who has initiated these typologies, or which types of actors have been centrally involved in the typology development. In the examples that we examined, these are the main ones: either national governments, national statistics institutes, or then research institutes and universities. So you could say that it's research and policy that have been the sort of initiators of these typologies. And of course, in many cases, we see that there has been a lot of collaboration with different actors. And it seems that this is something that sort of...
Ahora les oigo dos veces.
Claro, porque tienes que cerrar la otra.
Seems that someone is not muted, but anyhow, yes, one of the conclusions that we also drew from this assessment was anchoring the typology development with different perspectives, with different policy and research perspectives has been something that has contributed to the usefulness and relevance of these types of typologies. We can also identify that the typologies that we examined, that there are essentially two areas where they are used. It's either to support policy and planning at different spatial scales, be it national or regional level, in some cases also to guide interventions more locally. In some cases, it's more about supporting policy in general terms, but also in supporting evaluation, distribution of funds. So this idea of supporting policy and planning is quite central in many of the typologies that we examined. And then the other key use is really analysis and research, statistical monitoring. So many of the typologies have more been developed for different types of analytical purposes, and then in ways where you can incorporate other types of data then to these typologies to conduct further analysis and use these typologies as an analytical lens, so to say. And of course, it's also important to acknowledge that many of these typologies are used for both, so they are not mutually exclusive, and in many cases, the typologies are used for both policy and planning, as well as analytical purposes. So in the Granular project, our aim is to develop a multi-dimensional territorial typology for Europe, a rural typology, and sort of when we looked at some of these technical aspects, there are some learnings that we can draw from this work and from these examples. So first of all, worth also mentioning here that we in Granular, the focus is on rural areas. So we will work to develop a rural typology to characterize rural areas. And many of the typologies that we examined are rural typologies, but then in the broader sense, there are also typologies that are more general typologies, where the idea is to distinguish between different types of urban areas and ruralities. So the notion of urbanity and rurality and urban-rural linkages is quite central in these typologies. What's also noteworthy is that when we looked at these different typologies, most of the typologies are at LAO level, so often categorizing municipalities. But then in some countries, the typologies have been developed at more fine-grained levels, at sub-municipality levels, and in some cases at the grid level, such as in the Finnish example, to name one. And of course, something that then seems to be central for being useful when we're talking about a typology is really this scalability, and that it's possible to aggregate these fine-grained typologies up to more general territorial levels. So that's a key takeaway that we have a central consideration in the work that we are doing in granular. Also, what's common is that we see that many of the typologies have initially perhaps been more based on single components, such as population density, but then over time, new dimensions have been added. So many of the typologies most of the typologies, in fact, are multidimensional, and they often include some kind of component of population size or population density, but then combined with other dimensions such as different measures of accessibility, land use, different types of economic criteria, employment, or then perhaps something related to access to services. But overall, the typologies that we looked at are quite diverse, and in many cases, you could say that the tendency has been to go from more general typologies to more fine-grained multidimensional typologies, and this is a tendency seen in many of the countries that we looked at. And then to conclude, I wanted to highlight some of the key takeaways and sort of important considerations that are important to acknowledge when we're talking about territorial typologies. So firstly, it's obvious that these typologies seek to capture rural diversity, territorial diversity, but all typologies are somehow simplifications of reality. So it's also important then to acknowledge that no single approach or method makes a typology more accurate. And also another important takeaway is something that seems to be quite central for making these typologies useful, is that the technical aspects are, for example, what approach is used, what indicators are used, what territorial scale the typology is at, is related to what you actually want to measure and how you want to use the typology. And then, of course, it's central to align the typology with the specific research needs and policy needs as well. As a final point, then also transparency and communicating what the typology should be used for and perhaps what it should not be used for is also important, and then to acknowledge the limitations that there potentially might be with the different classifications. I think I have used up all my time there, so I thank you for your time. We might have time for questions in the end, but otherwise, you see my email address there, so you can contact me if you have any questions. But thank you so much, and I'll give the word back to you, Carla.
Thanks a lot, Mats, and I've seen someone clapping, and I guess that's very much merited for all the work done. And indeed, I think one of the key messages out of this very compressed state of art on rural and territorial typologies that I invite all of you to have a look at is that we are slowly and progressively moving from single, let's say, component typologies towards typologies which include multiple components and that can better map rural diversity. And these leave the words to the next speaker that we have today, which is Henk Oostinde from the Wageningen University and is also partner of the Granular project, who has been working, in fact, on developing a conceptual framework to characterize rural areas on the idea of functionalities and multifunctionalities. And so, Henk, you are going to talk us a little bit on what are those functionalities and how they can be used to characterize different rural areas, different ruralities. So I leave you the word, and my colleague, if you could share the screen with the presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Carla, for this nice introduction. I elaborated this introduction together with my colleague, Bettina Bock. She was also involved in our contributions to the Granular project, and she's a professor in rural inclusion, marginalization tendencies, shrinking rural areas. That's her specific field of expertise. myself is more interested. I'm more interested in agricultural dynamics, rural SMEs, and sustainable food systems dynamics. And what I want to do today is especially focus on some key aspects of the way how we theorize rurality within Granular, to present the prototype Rural Diversity Compass, which was one of our concrete contributions to the project, to come with some empirical illustration from Dutch living lab setting, which is for multiple reasons, I guess, of interest, because rural multifunctionality is rather a controversial and sensitive topic in the Netherlands, and associated with all kinds of policy dilemmas, which might be also of relevance for other settings. And then I will end with some conclusions which return to the prototype Rural Diversity Compass. Next slide, please. This is a figure which summarizes our multispatial approach of rurality. It makes a distinction between different types of boundary orientations. If you study rurality, and we introduce the absolute space, the relative space, the relational space, and the circular space. The absolute space, which is mainly interested in, at least focusing on spatial boundary settings, so where to distinguish the rural from the urban, on the continuum from the rural to the urban, what we can distinguish. The relative space is much more focusing on boundary crossing issues in relation to topics as food chain dynamics, labor markets, commuting, that type of boundary crossing and flows and mobility issues, which is put central in relative spatial approaches. The relational lens is much more focusing on spatial boundary blurring, so focusing on the relevance and the growing relevance of non-proximity, spatial proximity relations. You can think of digital proximity, cognitive proximity, cultural proximity. So it's much more focusing on network relations, which makes it increasingly difficult to distinguish the rural from the urban. And that's also the scholars that speak of ruralization tendencies that you can notice in the urban settings, for example, through urban food movements, and on the other hand, urbanization tendencies in rural areas. So those approaches really question the significance of making the distinction and following that rural-urban dichotomy. And the last circular space approach, which partly overlaps with the others, but has been included in the figure because it's in particular of importance in relation to transformation processes towards circular economies. And then you have to look at the flows of resources, and especially natural resources, but not exclusively in terms of rural-urban boundary crossing, and then the spatial dimension is put central. Next, please. This is the second key aspect of our understanding of rurality, and then the multifunctionality of rural areas is put central. And this figure basically wants to visualize that rurality becomes of importance and relevance, in particular in relation to its ability and capacity to integrate different functionalities. And here we make a distinction between 4 functionalities: the residential, the productive, the recreational, and the environmental functionality, which in their togetherness create a strong rurality, and are often indeed also expressed in terms of the quality of the rural spatial features. And in this figure, we further point at the disbalances that might emerge in relation to the functionality, which in effect become then a kind of undermining of the strength of rurality and the spatial qualities and the distinctiveness of rurality. I'm not going to refer to those disbalances. Quite a bit are mentioned here. They don't pretend to be all inclusive. There might be others, but it gives you an impression of what type of disbalance you couldn't relate to those functionalities, and which could result in the end in undermining of its specific features, distinctiveness, qualities, however you want to call it. Next, please. Now that's these two key aspects of our approach of rurality, and this multi-spatiality and multi-functionality, have been brought together in this prototype rural diversity compass. And basically the compass tries to further characterize those functionalities as introduced earlier by a set of 24 components, which as a whole and in the specific interrelations are thought to be an additional step towards a more profound understanding of rural diversity. I don't have the time here to go into all those components. Quite a bit speak for themselves and are quite straightforward, I would say. Others, such as cohesion and well-being, but also perhaps foodscapes and ecosystem service delivery, might need some further specification to also delineate them in relation to others. You can find that in the deliverable that we just submitted for the granular projects, and that is now available for everyone, as I understood. I guess it's important to mention, and what I want to stress, especially in this presentation, is that those components can be perceived as specific drivers of rural differentiation tendencies, and in that sense also leverages for policy interventions. They represent the boundary orientations in different ways, as I introduced before. They also provide all kinds of opportunities for indicator selection and elaboration at different scales, but also more quantitatively or qualitatively. And what I could further say that their positioning might be sometimes somewhat arbitrary. Yes, some such as a digital infrastructure are not only related to residential functionality, but could be also associated with productive functionality. But the key aspect is that we want to stretch through this rural diversity compass that they become especially meaningful in their interrelations and their interconnections and in their interdependencies. And as a whole, they provide then as such more detailed and profound insights in contemporary rural differentiation processes. Next, please. I want to further mention that those interactions and interdependencies are critical in rural governance and rural proofing aspirations that we can notice at different scale levels. And those could be perceived rural governance. The compass in itself provides insight into the stakeholders, the place-specific space stakeholders of those processes, rural diversity processes, and become also of relevance in relation to rural proofing at different scale levels. And here we also included in the outer quadrant of the compass the notions social, spatial, and climate justice that are partly related to those functionalities, which want to emphasize that rural governance and rural proofing is always about the distribution of burdens and benefits between social groups, between places, and between generations. At the same time, we realize that those notions, those justice notions, as also emphasized by justice scholars, that they don't only exist of distributive aspects, but also the procedural aspects. And that goes back then to the representations and the participation of those policy processes that could be characterized through the different components of the compass. There's also a reference to the notion of rural resilience. It's one of the key notions that's also mentioned in the long-term vision of rural areas. The guiding principle for those long-term visions for policy making. From our compass prototype compass perspective, rural resilience is then something which relates to the ability to create balances and rebalances the functionality of rurality, and the distributive and procedural perspectives are also part of that. So that is, in our understanding, a step forwards towards the operationalization of the resilience notions, which in itself is often referred to in policy documents, but mostly with hardly any transparency regarding its definition. Next, please. Now, if we go to the Dutch setting, and then the prototype compass enables us to illustrate in different ways its relevance. In our Dutch setting, we collaborate closely with Dutch most rural municipalities, as they are organized in an interest organization, P10 it's called, and that P10 organization wants to address in particular the specific well-being needs and well-being contribution of those most rural municipalities. And the needs are in particular related to the services, the basic services, accessibility and affordability topic, contributions, much more to rural contributions in terms of ecosystem, wider ecosystem service delivery for proximate urban centers, which is, in their opinion, insufficiently recognized, but also remunerated by those urban centers. So they want to put it on the agenda, and the prototype compass enables to position and to profile those topics in that broader setting of different drivers and differentiation tendencies of rural dynamics. It's also an opportunity, gives also the opportunity to position those interest topics of the P10 in relation to a wider context of manifold claims on scarce rural land resources. And we could refer to the pressure on those resources from agricultural tendencies and dependencies on food exports, and the inbuilt necessity of highly food export dependent farm business models to growth and to expand, which is quite prominently present in the Dutch setting. There's also the need for extensification of agricultural practices in relation to all kinds of agri-environmental issues. But there's other pressures that should be mentioned, which having more urban background, such as the need for affordable housing, which might be not directly of impact on those P10 municipalities, but indirectly through pressures on land prices also affects those other the potentials of agricultural dynamics. There's pressures that come from renewable energy sourcing, wind parks, solar parks. There's pressures that originate from the climate change mitigation needs, especially in relation to water management. There's the pressure, urban pressures from leisure and recreational activities. So there's lots of pressure on scarce land resources in the Netherlands, which explain the social, spatial, and climate justice issues that we also address through our compass. And the Netherlands knows certainly since 2-3 years and a long and rather persistent tradition of farmers demonstration and farmers upheaval and rural discontent, which clearly reflects that type of pressures on scarce land resources, but also overall incapacity and inability of national policy setting to deal with that type of functionality, reintegration, and rebalancing efforts.
Sorry for interrupting you. 1 minute left. We are a bit behind schedule. Thanks.
Okay. Now, maybe next. Yes, please. The next slide.
This one or this
one? Next one, please.
Wait, this one?
It's frozen in my screen. I don't see the next slide.
The national rural policy making dilemmas.
Okay, here. This is what the slide that I was looking for. Yes. Now there's these policy-making dilemmas have been identified based on collaboration between various national research centers in the Netherlands, and based on a synthesis of the outcomes of various scenario studies with different disciplinary backgrounds. And it touches upon the role of the Netherlands in relation to global food security, the role of animal production in sustainable food systems. I guess we all are familiar with that. The issue of land sparing and land sharing in relation to spatial planning, which is also dealing with the topic of function integration, rural function integration, or rural function segregation, and what would be the most efficient in terms of land use. There's an issue in relation to supranational exchange of policy objectives or not, and that touches upon the topic of how comparative analysis of comparative advantages could be preserved for the interest of the agro-industrial setting in the Netherlands, and thus producing in a delta area with relatively favorable conditions for food production. And should that be continued, and maybe also by an exchange of policy objectives, for example, in relation to carbon emission objectives, where the Netherlands exchange that type of objectives with Nordic countries, where there are more favorable conditions for carbon emission reduction, and that it could then be compensated with food production. That type of discussions are also part of national policy-making dilemmas. And then the last one, the further intervention in consumer behavior policy, acceptability, and necessity. It's something which is really brought up by those that are much more in favor of function integration and see it as an national and important prerequisite, necessity, condition for function integration, which allows for other types of rural business models and much more territorial urban-rural synergy expressions than possible within that agro-industrial model, which is much more based on function segregation.
Sorry, Anke, could we go to the conclusion? We are behind schedule. Yeah, the slides, thanks.
Yeah. So returning to the prototype compass, we see it as an analytical tool for a better understanding of rural functionality, dynamics, drives, and outcomes. It could be also a supportive tool for more place-specific rural governance and rural proofing, which much more starts from accommodating rural diversity instead of focusing on urban-rural disparities. And then the third conclusion, it's a prototype. It's a prototype compass which needs further testing and validation through a forthcoming granular and ongoing granular activity within its living lab settings, but also in relation to data sourcing and data analysis activities that are underway. So far, sorry for my...
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks for your intervention and sorry for cutting off. We're a little bit behind schedule and it's still nice to have the discussion. So we have seen how granular approach is considering different functionalities to characterize rural areas. And because of that, now I would like to give the floor to the next speaker, which is Louis Dijkstra from the Joint Research Center and has worked on the concept of functional rural areas as well as functional urban areas. So he will be in fact presenting also one of the latest reports that has just been published in December last year. Louis, I give you the floor for highlighting the concept of functional rural areas for us. Thanks.
Thank you. I hope you can see my slides. Are they in full screen mode?
Yes, perfect.
Awesome. I will stick to 15 minutes. I'll try and even speed up. It's a short presentation about how we come up with a proposal to develop functional rural areas. They're inspired by market towns, these settlements in a wider rural setting that offer a lot of private but also public services, post office, grocery store, bank, schools, doctors, you name it. They're also a community center. You know, they attract people for a weekly market, for cafes, restaurants, maybe it has a small cultural center or a community center. We don't think of these market towns as major employment centers, right? So it's different from, say, a metropolitan area where a lot of the employment is based in the city. No, it is some jobs there, but a lot of commuting happens in different directions. It's very dispersed, and a lot of people obviously may work from home, as farmers tend to do. So we have 5 simple rules. Each functional rural area has to contain at least one village or town. It has to have at least 25,000 inhabitants. It can be smaller if the closest town or village is more than an hour away. If another functional area is more than an hour away, it cannot be combined. If it's less than half hour apart, then they are combined because they probably share a lot of services. And functional rural areas cover the entire territory outside the functional urban areas. So I think of it as the rural twin of the urban functional areas. So how do we do it? First, we define rural centers. That's the biggest town or village in a 10-minute drive. Then we create a catchment area around each center. So people go to the nearest, biggest center. Then we combine catchment areas that are too small or are very close together. And then we have 2 types. We have at the grid level, functional rural areas, which we call FRAGs. And then we also define municipalities or local administrative units, which we then call FRAUs. So let's walk you through. These are all the settlements just outside of Paris, cities, towns, and villages. We select the biggest ones. You can see the green. We exclude the functional urban areas or FUAs. You can see them hashed. Then we create a local center catchment area around each local center. So small local centers have small catchment areas, large local centers have large catchment areas. And then we go through an iterative process to combine the ones that are very nearby, so less than a 30-minute drive apart, or don't have enough population. So if they're less than an hour's drive apart, and one of them has population that's less than 25,000, we combine. And so here you see the little red arrows, those get combined. And so you agglomerate them to make sure that you have something which is big enough that you're likely to find a primary school, maybe even a secondary school, a grocery store. Basically, most of the services that you would use regularly, daily or weekly. So Then we have the grid-based frags, and then the local administrative unit-based FRAUs. And we think we've compared them to, on the one hand, NUTS 3 regions, and on the other hand, local administrative units outside FUAs. And NUTS 3, we only look the ones that outside the metro regions, the non-metro NUTS 3s. And actually, we find that they're far more harmonized. So the diversity in terms of either area or population is much smaller in our FRAUs than in the LAUs or the NUTS 3s. We've tested some different parameters, the minimum time, the maximum time, or the target population. And the biggest impact comes from the target population. If we increase the target population to say 50,000 or 75,000 or 100,000, you see the number dropping substantially. At 100,000, we only find 1,000 FRAs, whereas at 250, we find almost 3,000 FRAs. Do they have service autonomy? That's what we wanted to check. And as we aggregate the smaller catchment areas to reach that target population, we actually see that more and more of them have services in their local FRA. So the graphs you see here is for 3 different countries, the population that lives in a FRA without that particular service. And so, for example, for secondary schools, after a couple of iterations, almost everybody lives in a functional area with a school. Hospitals are a bit more concentrated, so it doesn't fully drop to 0. But again, you see every time we iterate that combining, we see the share of population living in a functional area without a hospital drops. So that suggests that this is working quite well. Why do I like the functional rural areas? Up until now, we had municipalities, but there's thousands of them. It's very difficult to get reliable data for them. And the differences in size makes it very noisy to analyze. And now with these functional areas, we have a much more harmonized view and a much more functional view of the territory. And then we can use that to analyze things like population change. Here you can see population change between the last 2 censuses. And you see that in some places, the functional areas lost quite a lot. And even also in the urban ones, sometimes you can see a bit of an urban-rural contrast. Say in Poland, the functional urban areas tended to grow, where functional rural areas tended to shrink. But in Bulgaria and Greece, everything was shrinking. You can also analyze the changes in density, which will tell you a little bit about what type of population change is occurring. So here we've looked at neighborhood density, the average density an inhabitant lives in their neighborhood, the grid cell of 1 kilometer. And here we can see the changes in weighted density, so neighborhood density, and you see they're much smaller, and population reductions tend to lead to de-densification, whereas population growth typically leads to densification. This is not automatic. Population growth could happen in a suburban way that would lead to de-densification. If the population reduction happens in the most sparsely populated parts of a functional area, it would actually lead to densification. So here we've created those classes, and in red you can see places that had a reduction in population and a reduction in density, neighborhood density. In green both grew, but then in the other 2 colors, in yellow you can see population increased, but densities dropped. So in yellow you will see growth in the most dispersed parts of that functional area. In blue, and this is a really interesting one, you see that population becomes more concentrated over time despite shrinking. So that actually means that it's the more remote, the more sparsely populated part of that functional area that is losing most population. And as a result, neighborhood density actually goes up. Here you can look at what share of population lives more than 5-minute drive from a primary school. And you can see there are still quite a few places in the EU where lots of people, more than 50%, live that far away from a primary school. This also occurs in small islands. course, if we see these ongoing population reductions, that may again lead to further distances, etc. Okay, trying to wrap up, stick to my time. We've created this to mimic autonomous service areas. The idea is also sometimes referred to as a rural daily system, really something where you can find what you need usually. I think the results are very promising. We have created also some variants that you can check online on the link above. We're really very much welcoming comments. This is in a consultation process, but we're also applying this to the OECD countries together with the OECD, and we even have some global versions of the functional rural areas. And then we want to start to do some validations, check on private services, public services. I showed you a small example there, but we want to investigate that more. We also want to check, do most trips start and stop in the same functional area? Does that capture it? And we want to understand more about where is employment based in these functional areas. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Lewis, for making also the effort of being time and for sharing this great amount of work that you are doing. And as you say, is open to consultation. So I guess feel free to reach out also with comments, and we'll have some time for discussion just after our next presentation. And our next presentation is going to be with Francesco Mantino, which is working as senior researcher at the Italian Council for Research in Agricultural and Economics, and have had a very proven track of work and previous research on rural and regional development, from policy analysis to structural reforms, evaluation, and so on. And today is here to present another approach and another view on functional rural areas and the notion of multifunctionalities of rural areas from the recent work that was done as part of the Rustic project. So I leave you the floor, Francesco, and then we look forward also to our next discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Carla. Thank you for this nice presentation, and thank you for this opportunity to present and discuss interaction of the result of this study with the results that GRC has just presented, because I think is an important work for us to be compared with our results. The objective, I would like to present partly the results of the first stage of this project, and in particular the report, the first report, that is the methodological report prepared by me, Barbara Forcina, and Amy Morse, on exploring the rural-urban continuum. But this is only part of the presentation. The second part of the presentation is about what implication there are from this report on the analysis of functional rural areas. So the main result of this report concern the analysis of the literature concerning the functional relations, and the identification of the necessary steps in classifying a new topologies of rural areas. We have 14 pilot regions where we collect qualitative and quantitative data. So our approach is try to combine top-down and bottom-up provision of data at the local level. In the report, there is also a theoretical framework in order to analyze relation between functions, process of transition, because transition is a specific and a particular issue in our research, and the resilience capacity to respond to the transition of our pilot regions. And finally, the report contains also a proposal of data indicators to identify the different function and the resilient capacity. This part is especially developed in working package 2 concerning the data. In the report, we try to interpret the diversity of rural areas as a more complex issue than that deriving from the proximity to urban center. And we examine the functional area concept that is usually applied to urban and regional development. And also we try to study the functions that rural areas can provide to the collectivity, in particular the production, the consumption, and the ecosystem functions. In this regard, we are making a work that is very similar to our colleagues of Granular. And it could be very interesting to compare the result of this aspect. Then we outline the importance of a mixed approach to identify rural areas. There are specific issues concerning the concept of functional areas. Functional areas definition is based especially on the social and economic relation between residents across the space within a specific area. In literature, the most common approach is especially the use is based on the parameter represented by commuting to work close with a labor market area or an employment zone. And we found that criteria and parameters used in the different countries to define functional areas depend strongly from policy aims, the common structure of the different countries, and the different population distribution in the territories. We found also that functional areas is a concept that is used for policy purposes, but especially for employment and industrial policies, never for agriculture and rural development policies. We underline the importance of defining a new definition of rural areas, starting from three fundamental points. There are, in the last few years, new and neo-endogenous theories that emphasize the capacity to generate development mechanisms within the rural areas. There is also an emphasis on networks enabling connectivities beyond the geographical proximities. And also there is the importance of rural areas as providers of complex and diversified functions. We try to define three main blocks of functions that are production, ecosystem functions, and consumption. We define the main aspect of these functions, and also we try to define main indicators to represent these functions. The main challenges in this exercise is the heterogeneity of data available at the local level, at the country level, and also the difficulty of getting data comparable between countries and different areas. So the approach that we try to follow is a pragmatic approach. We try to start from the delineation of rural areas, rural and urban areas at low level, using the curve classification. We use also the information on accessibility to services and demographic change, and we try to define quantitatively and qualitatively also the rural areas functions. Obviously, this was the original project, that the original design of our research, but now that we have at disposal the GRC definition of functional rural areas, we have to take into account of it. So the objective of this analysis, we follow a parallel line of work. We try to test functional rural areas definition in the different pilot regions, and try to combine also qualitative and quantitative data, especially the data on demography and accessibility. And at the same time, we would like also to compare results coming from the functional rural areas proposed by the GRC with other concept of functional areas proposed in the country. For example, there are interesting experiments and exercise in France or in Italy concerning the local system of labor based on the commuting to work flows. So it could be very interesting to compare what are the different results in terms of travel time to the nearest settlement as proposed by GRC, also with other approaches. But we have to take into account that in applying the concept of functional rural areas using the travel time to the nearest settlement, we should take into account that this could be not the only approach, and that travel time could be combined with other criteria, especially criteria that take into account the disparities along the rural continuum. There are, in our view, three kinds of disparities that should be taken into account. Disparities between developed regions and less developed regions, disparities between mountain, hill, and lowlands, geographical disparities, and also demographic disparities. So we try to find some difference, for example, in a country like Italy, where the availability of data at low level allows us to define the distance from the main services, and we can find, obviously, as in other countries, that there are strong differences between rural areas, town and suburbs, and cities. But the average distance hides very important difference within rural areas. The first kind of difference are between regional development. If we compare the access to different kind of services in less developed regions and transition regions, we found that there is a gap with developed regions. Another type of disparity very important is geographical. The distance to from primary school, secondary school, healthcare, and train station in rural areas, in mountain rural areas, is highly significant, highly relevant if compared with the distance in lowlands areas. And the same happens when we compare, for example, rural areas with steady high decline, demographic decline, with rural areas with steady growth. The access to the different services is completely different from the other areas. So to come to the conclusion, we need to find obviously an intermediate level of granularity between NUTS3 and LAO2, and I think that results from the GRC report are very interesting, but at the same time, economic, geographical, and demographic disparities should be taken into account. A method of definition of functional rural areas, essentially based on travel time to the nearest settlements, I think assume that the nearest settlements can provide most of the services. This is not true when we, for example, examine countries where there are different kind of disparities, as we have shown. Nevertheless, in a setting of deep territorial disparities, we think that the assumption of the market town could lead to overestimate the role of the nearest settlements and underestimate the needs of the most marginal communities. So the conclusion is that the work that has been done until now is surely a step forward in understanding the difference between rural areas, but we need to test more carefully some combined criteria in our regions. And I think that in the next steps of the Rustic project, we will try to do this. And it could be very interesting to compare what we can get from this analysis and the results that other studies can reach in the meantime. But I think there will be arguments for discussions in the future, and also in the table round that we are going to discuss now. Thank you for this opportunity again.
Thanks a lot, Francesco. I think it has been great, and you really raised a lot of points on similarities, but also differences across these three approaches that have been presented. So I'm very glad that now we have some time for a table round, which is going to be moderated by Serafin. And please don't hesitate to drop a question or contribution in the chat so that they can be picked up also during this discussion. Serafin, I give you the floor, and also to the previous speakers.
Thank you. That's great. I mean, I appreciate that is for the audience a lot to take. And I know many of the audiences, we have, of course, like a lot of academics, But we also have a lot of policymakers, actually people who actually implement, in some cases, I know very well, they are actually implementing functional area approaches. And today they came to the meeting thinking, okay, what are the potential implications of all this leading work that is being done? So that's, anyway, that's the first question, and always a question for everybody. If you could try to be brief to answer this question, which is trying to be in a after you done the technical the contribution, maybe now something maybe more colloquial. I mean, how the work you're doing, redefining ruralities, functional areas, can improve our understanding of rural areas, but also potentially what could be done. I think how come the work you are doing could be potentially, I insist, of course, potentially improve policy making in rural areas. A very simple question, and hopefully you can provide a very colloquial answer in a way summarizing what you have said in the first round. So maybe you can start with the same order, and we start with minutes.
Sorry, Francesco. If you don't mind, you can stop sharing your presentation, please. Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, thank you for the question, Serafin. That's an excellent question, and trying to be as brief and simple in my wording as possible. I think that what we are all doing is somehow trying to increase our awareness of how diverse rural areas in Europe are. And I would say that somehow by doing this, we can hopefully change the narrative of what rural areas are, to give a more sort of multifaceted picture of this, that rural areas are not just this or that, that we are really talking about a wide range of different types of areas. So yeah, in brief, that's what I would say.
Okay, Henk, what do you have to say about that?
I guess I'm fully agree with Matt was just saying. We're struggling, of course, with the notion of rural. If we accept that the rural is increasingly diverse and there's lots of differentiation tendencies, how useful is it to continue with the notion of rural? And I also understand that emergence of the notion rural functional areas is a kind of mirror image of the urban functional areas. But I would say in that way how it's approached now, it's really focusing on that residential functionality, and that might provide all kinds of justifications for policy interventions. But maybe, and we could discuss that perhaps, and I also would like to hear Louis' reaction on that, shouldn't we move from a kind of rural functional area definition to a rural functionality webs definition, where you take the interaction with other functionalities also explicitly into account as a guidance for policy making? And would that be a step forward in relation to your understanding of rural functional areas or not? And I fully agree, and I fully see the complexities in terms of data analysis, et cetera, but I would argue that in the way how we use now that notion, rural functional areas, that interaction of functionality is still insufficiently dealt with. But I leave it to that.
Okay, so we only not having a question, we also have already a bit of a debate. So I think the floor is yours, Louis. See how you can take that. Thank you.
Thank you, Serafin. I really liked Francesco's presentation, and I like Henk's question. I think functional areas provide, as Francesco said, an intermediate level between the lows and the nuts that are fairly harmonized in terms of population and area, but it also allows us to verify what functions are present, right? We can check. Do you have a grocery store in your functional area? Do you have a school? Do you have a doctor? And so even though it's based on the assumption that market towns provide that service, and that's done because we don't have enough detailed information to cover all the services, but we use this as a template And we don't necessarily go only to the nearest settlement, we go to the nearest settlement taking into account the size of the settlement, right? So we actually go to a town if that one's bigger and a little bit further away. But with data, and especially with detailed local data, we can check what's missing. What do you need to improve the access to services in your functional area? And we can see the trends in terms of population change. We can see the trends also in access to services. Italy is closing a lot of their schools because they have fewer school-aged children. What's the impact? Which functional areas are affected? So for me, it is a fairly neutral lens that we can then characterize and fill to identify problems and fix them.
Well, very interesting, this debate. I don't think that neutral is the right word because nothing is neutral, especially when you use this lens for policy purposes. So we should, I would like to distinguish between the necessary need to go ahead in the research and understanding the difference between rural areas and also in terms of functions and the use of this concept for policy purpose. I think this second step is a little bit premature in my view, because in order to use functional rural areas for policy purpose, we have to define much more well-detailed analysis of what are the needs of rural areas. For example, we have the information on the distance between the single municipality and the different services, primary school, secondary school, and so on. But for example, healthcare service doesn't mean anything because you can have very different services within this information. And for policy purpose, you need much more granulated and detailed information for policy purpose. But for research, we have to work with what we have available. So I will distinguish the two issues. And I fear that this functional rural areas concept is used for policy purpose because
Okay. I'm getting to that.
Yeah.
I'm actually taking the chance that Jose Manuel Gomez Jimenez, who I know, we spoke in a number of events together, and actually I think was the first time the functional rural areas classification was published or presented in an academic conference, at least outside JRC. I mean, for somebody who's not JRC, was us like a year and a half ago. And I remember because there were politicians there that they saw the map of Spain redrawn using functional rural areas. Say, oh my God, the European Union is redrawing the map. And luckily that's not a very Eurosceptic country. I remember in the UK when we did that with the NATS areas, and there was an EU conspiracy. So, for reassurance, Luis, this is something that that's because it's to the credit of GRC, it's a public map. People can see this is methodology. Now that we have the paper, so it's all transparent. But I think for reassurance, how do you think the implications, maybe not tomorrow or maybe not for the post-2027 cohesion policy, but how do you think if this work, and we can see here today already and I appreciate the speakers, a very significant debate of things that need to be clarified, but how do you think this classification could be used in the future? Whether it's a chance that could help actually, if not redefine boundaries, at least better understand them and understand the provision of services. How could be the practical implication of that in due course? and also to provide some reassurance to people that the EU is not conspiring to withdraw the municipal power of Spain or other countries.
No, for me, it's primarily a lens to try and describe different parts of rural Europe in using multiple dimensions. It's really an attempt to understand and really to understand areas that have links. We're hoping to get data on trips for a number of countries so we can see where are people going, you know, is there an obvious center? Does the functional rural area capture those trips? For policy purposes, I would be quite cautious. This is just, you know, a fairly simple and transparent method, but I'm sure that there are lots of other considerations, you know, close historical ties, intermunicipal cooperation, which, you know, we completely ignore. But I do think it's useful as a sense of, okay, if you're not cooperating yet, with whom would you want to cooperate within your municipality? But just to assure everybody, I don't think Agri or Regio are planning to distribute funding using functional rural areas anytime soon. It's an analytical vehicle, but it's an analytical vehicle which responds to a need. We can't keep using laws. We can't just use NUTS 3s. They're too big. And this is, you know, a way of trying to solve that problem that gives us a better view of rurality across the Union.
Indeed. I mean, I still remember the waves it made when the Tercet regulation was approved, and everybody was, and in the end, you know, it's there, but, you know, it's used if it's needed. I mean, not like a obligation. So, I mean, let's perhaps as a final question to everybody, because I think the ocean colleague here who wrote in the text, there's an issue relevant question saying that in essence, well, you can see the question yourself, but, you know, in essence, whether you think the work you are doing in your very different angles, as we have seen, might not have a bias to try to equalize what is a rural area with an urban area, and not trying to find the distinctiveness of rural areas. I mean, if I understood correctly the question, but, you know, what I mean, the question that Henk particularly highlighted, I mean, the issue about we are struggling to understand rurality, and that's something that we do. So maybe we can start with Henk, and then you perhaps the rest of you could react to that, and that will be perhaps just the last question. Thank you, Henk.
Thank you. I did not get the question. What is exactly the question that you put it on the table?
Whether a lot of the work you are doing respectively might not carry the bias that you're trying to equalize too much, or that's the possibility. What is a rural area with what it is an urban area. And I remember you particularly said that, you know, it is still at the very level that you're working, it's difficult to conceptualize rurality because of the diversity. So, you know, are we trying to harmonize things that are intrinsically difficult to harmonize in terms of actually identify what it is distinctively rural?
No, I would argue that we moving into a direction that we recognizing more and more that the notion of rural is in need for further specification. What type of rural and rurality we are speaking of, and how distinctive and different it is indeed in relation to urbanity in urban areas. And I would say if you do recognize the growing diversity of rural areas and rurality, and then in policy making process, the territorial approach should be more and more become leading, and the distributive aspects of policy intervention in the way I have introduced should be put central, and not so much rural or not rural. So I wouldn't plea for a territorial approach where the distributive aspects are much more prominently present, and that we move away from that attempts to continue to distinguish the rural from its wider territorial settings and features. And that's not a way to progress, I would say. So that would be my starting point of thinking.
Okay, Mats, maybe because you know, that's a core element of your work to understand the urban-rural dynamics. How you have to say about that?
Well, yeah, it's a difficult question, but I would say that, I mean, the starting point for us is to create a rural typology at the grid level, 1 kilometer grids. And I think that there it's quite important to acknowledge that, for example, if we talk about municipalities, municipalities are at the same time urban and rural and everything in between, especially if we look at the vast municipalities that we have in the Nordic countries and in Finland and in northern Sweden particularly. There, I think that if we categorize a municipality as being either 1, 2, or 3, then we're really missing the diversity that we're all trying to talk about. So I think that already by moving to a more granular level and identifying these sort of territorial differences within these administrative units, I think that we're already taking a step in the right direction.
Okay, well, some quick reaction from Franco and Luis.
Well, I think that we have at disposal now much more information than in the past. With the and I think this is a great advantage. The availability of the GURBA classification is a good starting point, but we have to proceed in a way that combine different criteria, not just one. And that depends on the different countries. We have not the same data in the different countries. This is a great problem. A second issue that I found very important is the definition of remote rural areas. That means the areas that are more in needs of interventions, complex interventions. And I think that, for example, in the regulation, there is a definition of remote rural areas that is quite critics, in my view, is not sufficient. So I think we should work much more on this and try to define which are rural areas more in need of intervention. And on this point, there is a big space to work in my view.
I'm conscious we're running out of time, or we're already over time, so I'll be telegraphic. I think one of the interesting suggestions is in the chat. Could we just talk about functional areas? Do we need to distinguish between urban and rural? We're actually testing if we apply the same approach to cities. We're testing to see whether we get results that look similar to functional urban areas, for example. I don't think we're trying to make rural areas urban, as one question said in the chat. I think we're really trying to understand, can people meet their needs? Can they find the services they need? And Francesco's point about the difference between healthcare facilities is incredibly important. You know, there's a big difference between a large hospital and just a GP practice and a nurse, right? But they're both healthcare facilities. So I think the key question is, can we understand which functions are missing, which services are missing, and how can we help people to get those services? I think that's the key message for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to purposely leave it a bit longer because I thought it was a quite lively debate and actually explores quite a lot of the issues that had to be grappled here. And maybe to sum up, Carla would like to add some final words, but thank you very much for your contribution. Carla?
So thanks really much to everyone for this amazing discussion. I think we started with overall the agreement that we need to better understand the rural areas and therefore have more granular data. And on this, I think we are all on the same page, and we need to characterize rural diversity, not looking at it as a unique block, but really understanding the heterogeneity, etc. And through that, the notion of functionalities and multifunctionalities is very key, and we have been seeing different ways of exploring that, different approaches proposed that has been already proposed, including the one of functional rural areas from the Joint Research Center. And the next phase is towards testing how these approaches can actually be functioning, but also making sure that they do not increase disparities, which was a very important point raised up also. And this is, I think, the conclusion, or at least my takeaway message, in addition to what has been said so far. So I thank you all for being part of the discussion, and we hope to be able to continue and keep refining the work that we are all doing. Thanks a lot, and wish you a nice day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.